Hey everyone, Jawad here with Hit the Apex podcast. How's things going? Thank you for tuning in this week. And it's our first race review, F1 race review for the year, for 2020. I think, it's a significant moment, that we've finally crossed that bridge after so many months of uncertainty. And then, of course, going back to March and, you all know the story. I don't need to keep repeating it to you, do I? No, we all know what happened. But yeah, no, F1's back properly this time. We had our first race in Austria, the Austrian Grand Prix. Such a great race, such an epic race, and I think, the perfect way for F1 to start in 2020, given everything that's going on, not just with the pandemic and how that's pretty much changed the face of the championship this year, but, even the activism going on, with the We Races One initiative and Black Lives Matter and everything as well, which played a significant part, I thought, in the weekend's proceedings at the Red Bull Ring. The ceremony pre-race was pretty moving. I got to say, I did put out a tweet saying I did feel a bit emotional seeing all the drivers united on the grid wearing their shirts with End Racism on there, and Lewis Hamilton, of course, with Black Lives Matter on the front. And then you had the drivers, 14 of the 20 drivers kneeled during the national anthem, and then there were 6 who did not kneel, which, I'm just going to address it straight away because it did kind of divide a few people, and there's been a lot of debate about it during the week about how, it doesn't really seem like they're united if you've got, 14 drivers kneeling and then you have 6 that aren't. And I'm going off what Lewis Hamilton has come out and said just recently, perhaps even overnight, about how, he's grateful that the drivers who did take a knee did do that, but also he has no issue with the people who didn't. And Daniel Ricciardo, you would have read his quotes, I'm sure, about how some drivers felt uncomfortable with the idea of taking a knee because of what it represents in their cultures and in their countries as well. So, and I think it's a big win regardless the fact that they had the shirts on, they were all united. They all came together with the GPDA to do this, and the whole sport itself is united on this matter. You had in big letters End Racism on the side of the pit building as well, which every time you saw a wide shot of the pit building on the when you run the circuit clockwise, that those images would have been beamed out to every household in the world. So that would have been watching Formula One across the weekend. So it was very moving to see that, and just I keep saying it. Racism is not a political issue. In fact, the way I describe it is that it's a societal cancer that has been just plaguing generations upon generations of people, and it needs to end. And no better time to bring this into focus and really tackle it. So, great job on that front. And it'll be good to see their the consistency in the message as well, and just seeing it, every race, them bringing this into the fore. So very good there. Race itself, well, how do I describe it? I already said it at the beginning. It was a cracker of a race. It was very, very epic. And again, I almost said an expletive. I think I've been using too much of those lately. Not that I normally don't, but I think a little bit more lately with what's going on here down under. I'm sure you've heard the news if you follow news. If you follow world news and they talk about Australia and in particular the state of Victoria, Melbourne, where I live. It's not good, but I'll come to that a bit later and how that impacts the Supercars Championship, because there has been a few changes there. But while we're on the subject of Austria, we're talking about Austria. It's the dominant part of this podcast. Now, we're doubling down as well because we've got a second race this weekend too, the Grand Prix of Steiermark. instead of calling it Austrian Grand Prix 2. I like the ring of the Grand Prix of Steiermark. So, because a few people have already said Styrian Grand Prix sounds like, something in the Middle East, too close to Syria, is the Styrian Grand Prix being raced in Damascus, one asks. No, sorry, I don't think so. You've got the wrong number there. Epic start to the F1 season. Valtteri Bottas, out of the blocks, comes to win the race from pole position. It started off as a pretty kind of tame race with Mercedes running in formation, but with 10 laps to go, I think that's when all hell broke loose. But in between there, you had quite a few storylines across the weekend. Biggest one of them, of course, was Red Bull's multiple protests, actually. So it started off with Red Bull protesting the legality of the DAS system, so the dual-axis steering, which Mercedes revealed in testing back in 2001. Sorry, back in February. It's not been that long since pre-season testing, but yeah, back in February when they did pre-season testing. So at the end of the Friday practice sessions, Red Bull put in a bit of a protest to get some clarity from the FIA as to whether this system was considered legal or not, and on the grounds of steering or something like that, it was deemed to be fine. So whether this was Red Bull's attempt at trying to snuff out Mercedes with this, or for their own clarification, because they might have a system of their own in development that they might want to bring later on in the year, or perhaps even next year, given that we're carrying the same cars over. So that kind of dominated Friday's headlines. We also had the pink Mercedes as well. Racing Point were pretty quick straight off the bat, and I guess the way that their race ended up kind of was a bit of a disappointment considering the pace that they had, but that ties back into what I said last week when I said looking at the whole year ahead, given that we've got a shortened championship and also how it looks, I reckon McLaren will be the team to finish fourth in the Constructors' Championship, even though they don't have the faster car compared to Racing Point. On consistency and on how strong their drivers are, they'll get the job done in that instance. And they did, because Lando Norris, this was like just a pipe dream at the start of the weekend, or even after qualifying, when he qualified fourth on track, and then was elevated to third because of another protest of Red Bull's, but this time it went in their favour with Lewis Hamilton getting a penalty. This was due to, in Q3, Valtteri Bottas, after setting his fastest lap, he was on his second flying lap in Q3, ended up touring the kiddie litter and brought out the yellow flags. Now, Hamilton just behind him, still P2, needed to set a faster lap to get pole position. What happens is, initially, they investigated him because the stewards, that is, thought that he didn't slow down sufficiently for that particular part of the track where the yellow flags were out. So they dismissed that. They said, yeah, that's all good. And then what happened afterwards is that, or not even afterwards, 24 hours later, like half an hour before the race, in fact, there was the protest from Red Bull saying that, we've just got this new footage that we'd like to show you of Hamilton going through at full speed through that particular part of the track where there was a yellow flag. And Red Bull's precedent, I guess, for this was the penalty that Max Verstappen got back in Mexico last year when, again, it was Bottas who ended up in the wall at the final corner, and Verstappen, who was on a flyer, in fact, he did take pole position on the track, had that stripped from him because he went through that part of the track with a yellow flag. Like, the obvious thing with the Verstappen incident was that clearly in front of him there was a crashed car in the wall. So, when you see that, you automatically have to, or your sensors tell you to lift off. Whereas with Hamilton, I guess Bottas was out the weeds, you might not have seen him. But it seemed very marginal anyway when you look at the footage. The yellow flag, and when the yellow was triggered on the digital screen, Hamilton was already like maybe his side of eye line, or his sight. His line of sight, that's the phrase I'm looking for. Line of sight. We love it. His line of sight might have been past it, because when you look at that image, in front of him, the next marshal post where the next LED board is, it's got green. So maybe he saw that and completely ignored the one that he just went past. But at the same time, the crime was committed and the penalty was there. Where I guess everyone's beef is with this is the fact that how come the stewards didn't have access to that footage in the first place on the Saturday after qualifying, instead of having to complete this rigmarole half an hour before the race. And there was no official announcement either from the stewards and by the FIA until maybe 10 minutes till race start, but everyone pretty much figured it out when the few of the journalists on site with their media centre looking down from the main grandstand to the grid saw that Red Bull were moving their gear to the second grid slot, Verstappen qualifying third and being moved up to second, and Mercedes moving all their stuff down to fifth. So there was a 3-place grid penalty handed to Hamilton for that. That was all done and over with. Hamilton basically, right, let's get stuck into the race. Mercedes running 1 and 2. As a result, Lando Norris was elevated to third as well, having qualified fourth. So, yep, Mercedes running in formation because Max was out of the race early on. Very, very big blow, I guess, championship-wise, and also the expectation that everyone had that he would be able to go for the three-peat there in Austria, but did not happen. Mechanical failure for Red Bull on lap 10. Same thing again happened to Daniel Ricciardo in the Renault as well. So, drivers who really need points this year need results, not, for their futures or for their seats. Ricciardo's future, we already know he's off to McLaren next year. But for Max, with a championship on the line, or so everyone seems to think, that he'll be in championship contention this year, having a 0 next to your name is not the best start. And for Dan as well, I guess it's more so for Renault that they really need to have a good year this year, because otherwise it's crunch time. I said it last week, and while I didn't dedicate a whole section to his greatness in Mr. Fernando Alonso, why not just mention that he will be back next year? The F1's biggest masochist is about to return, and he's returning for Renault. So, that I can talk about, dedicate a whole nother podcast on its own to talk about Alonso and everything. And I guess rightly so, there's a lot of people outraged with this decision for him to return, especially to a team like Renault, who they are not in that championship winning or race winning form that you would expect Alonso to want after the trying years that he had with McLaren, and then pretty much said, I wouldn't return to F1 if I didn't have a race winning car. Red Bull, Ferrari, Mercedes, they all don't want him. So Renault as well, with its own academy of drivers as well, it's a big finger at them too. Like, we spend all this money on training these young drivers and wanting to bring them through, but you've gone and got a guy who might be past his best by date in F1. We don't know. If you want to trust what Flavio Briatore says, if you really want to trust anything he says that Alonso's detoxed and ready to get back to racing. He said that last year, so who knows? But again, Alonso, just wherever he goes, as far as Formula One is concerned, it kind of turns toxic. But wait and see anyway. So Ricciardo, not a good result there for Renault, and for them in general, Renault, not a good result. Then more reliability problems, and it kind of isn't surprising when you've had these cars just sitting idle for months and months and months not racing, but there was so much chaos that perhaps more than expected, which was good, which was the surprise. So you had Lance Stroll then with concerns about his gearbox sensor, and then ultimately it failed and he had to retire, and it was a shame because Stroll was racing pretty strongly. He was racing against the likes of Vettel, who only qualified not second. What century am I talking about? Vettel only qualified 11th. He was fighting him and also another fast car as well. How silly of me that I don't remember. So Stroll was racing really well early on, and again, I said last week that it's going to be important year for him as well to prove in a car that is already proven that it's competitive to be able to get those results. And this is where I still think McLaren will beat them, is because their drivers can get the results, whereas Racing Point, it is a bit iffy. So Stroll out of the race early too, but those concerns that Racing Point had with the gearbox sensors was something that Mercedes then were concerned about, because obviously they supply gearbox and engine to them, or power unit, and given how ferocious the curbs are there in Austria, they're basically like having piranhas on the side of the track. Mercedes pretty much told their guys for the rest of the race, stay off the curbs, stay off the curbs, stay off the curbs, because it's same thing might happen. That's how fragile that they've built these power units and these gearboxes, that the more abuse you put them through like that, and it's pretty heavy abuse, it's just gonna destroy itself. So Mercedes kind of having to manage their race later on, but that's when the chaos began. That's when it became really fun. You had Kevin Magnussen on lap 26 losing his brakes, fighting Esteban Ocon into turn 3. Safety car came out. Magnussen was okay, but a disappointing start for Haas. You had, after the restart, during the safety car, you had the top 10 pit as well, crucial. Then after the safety car restart, you had Seb spinning at turn 3 while trying to pass Carlos Sainz. And I'm sure everyone at that moment thought one thing. If you've kept up to date with this Reddit user Alpha Max Nova and the videos that he creates after every race, or has done since last year, then yeah, it was all you could hear in that moment was Spinala. And I'm glad that he did a little video after the Grand Prix as well as a review. Say the line, Bart. That was in there. So Seb, again, you could talk on a whole nother podcast about that too. His mistake, and just all weekend is, complaining about how the car is a dog, a prancing mule, let's call it, because it is pretty much that kind of car. But you think back to when Alonso had that car, or that kind of car, when he was at Ferrari 2012, and he was able to take it to a championship. I'm not saying that, Alonso's any better than Vettel in certain areas, but it's just, is this, a guy that's beyond it as well? Now with Alonso taking the seat at Renault, what are the options for Seb to stay in F1 next year? It's looking pretty slim. So, and that spin, of course, doesn't help either. It didn't help Carlos Sainz's race either, kind of just consigned to the bottom half of the top 10, but still had some solid points on the table for him. I think he ended up finishing 5th in the end, so that actually was a solid result. Apologies, getting all my results crossed up for a second, looking back at last year's race almost. So strong result there for Sainz. Alex Albon having a bit of a lonely race in P3 early on. You had Checo Perez, Lando Norris and Charles Leclerc all running together. Weird that you mentioned Charles Leclerc and the Ferrari fighting a Racing Point and a McLaren, but that's the reality of the situation for Ferrari. Albon looking pretty nestled there in P3, but then